Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we uncover the stories that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into one of the most infamous and enduring criminal organizations in history, the Mafia. Now, when you hear the word Mafia, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the Godfather movies, secret handshakes, or a network of underground crime bosses calling the shots from smoky back rooms. But the reality is far more complex. The Mafia wasn't just about organized crime, it was a system of power, influence, and fear that embedded itself into politics, economies, and even pop culture. In this video, we'll explore how the Mafia rose from small Sicilian protection groups to a global empire, how it spread across continents, and how it shaped the modern world. We'll also uncover the code of silence that kept it running for generations and look at how law enforcement fought back. So, let's start at the very beginning, where it all started, the rocky landscapes of 19th century Sicily. Our story begins in Sicily, a land of breathtaking coastlines, medieval villages, and, well, centuries of corruption and unrest. The Mafia didn't emerge out of nowhere, it was born from chaos. In the 19th century, Sicily was a place where the law was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Landowners, merchants, and everyday people needed protection, not from criminals, but from the instability of the government itself. And so, local groups stepped in to help. These groups provided protection in exchange for loyalty and, of course, a hefty fee. Over time, they evolved into full-fledged crime syndicates. But the Mafia didn't stay confined to Sicily for long. It expanded beyond Italy, reaching deep into Europe, the United States, and beyond. The Mafia didn't just run illegal rackets, they infiltrated businesses, law enforcement, and even politics, shaping economies in ways few could have imagined. And despite countless government crackdowns, the Mafia has shown a remarkable ability to survive and adapt. From the days of extortion and smuggling to modern cybercrime and financial fraud, the Mafia continues to operate, proving that organized crime is, if nothing else, a business that evolves with the times. But to understand how it grew so powerful, we have to look at the conditions that allowed it to rise in the first place. To understand the Mafia, you have to picture 19th century Sicily, a place of deep economic disparity, corrupt officials, and weak law enforcement. This wasn't a land of fair trials and reliable justice. If you had wealth or power, you made your own rules. If you didn't, well, you had to pay someone who did. At the time, Sicily was struggling under foreign rule, and the government was ineffective at maintaining order. This power vacuum left everyday people vulnerable to theft, violence, and exploitation. So, local protection groups formed, not to stop crime, but to control it. These groups weren't exactly noble guardians of the weak. They offered protection, but at a price. If you paid up, your business was safe. If you didn't, well, accidents happened. And just like that, the Mafia was born. What started as loosely organized protection services quickly turned into a system of extortion and violence, with entire communities living under their influence. These groups grew in power and reach, spreading their control over markets, law enforcement, and even government offices. Fear was their greatest weapon. By making an example of anyone who resisted, the Mafia ensured that loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was required. If you crossed them, you disappeared. Simple as that. But Sicily wouldn't be the Mafia's only playground. Soon, they had their sights set on something bigger, America. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States, seeking better lives in cities like New York and Chicago. They arrived with nothing, no wealth, no political power, and often no English skills. Many of them settled in overcrowded neighborhoods, facing discrimination, low-paying jobs, and little protection from the law. But the Mafia saw opportunity in this chaos. Italian immigrants needed protection, jobs, and community. The Mafia could provide all three, for a price. Then came Prohibition, America's biggest gift to organized crime. When alcohol was outlawed in 1920, bootlegging became the gold rush of the underworld. The Mafia capitalized on this, creating massive smuggling and distribution networks, running illegal speakeasies, and making millions in the process. But success breeds conflict. Gang wars erupted, and the Mafia wasn't just fighting the police, it was fighting itself. Violence escalated, rival groups vied for power, and the Mafia's influence spread far beyond alcohol into gambling, extortion, and illicit businesses. And out of this chaos came the rise of a criminal empire, one that would define organized crime in America for decades. By the early 20th century, the Mafia in America had grown too big to be a chaotic free-for-all. Rival factions were constantly at war, and turf battles were drawing too much heat from law enforcement. Something had to change. Enter the five families: Lucchese, Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, and Colombo. These families didn't just randomly pop up, they were the result of a violent restructuring of power, orchestrated by one of the most infamous crime bosses in history, Salvatore Maranzano. He essentially divided New York City into territories, ensuring that each family had its domain. But even this wasn't enough to stop mafia bosses from betraying and killing each other for control. So, in 1931, another crime lord, Lucky Luciano, created the Commission, a governing body meant to resolve disputes and maximize profits. Think of it as a corporate board of directors, but instead of shareholder meetings, they had hits on anyone who stepped out of line. With this new structure, the Mafia wasn't just a collection of gangs, it was an organized business empire. The 5 families ran gambling, labor unions, loan sharking, and construction rackets. If money could be made, they were involved. But this kind of success required absolute loyalty. And that brings us to the unbreakable code that kept the Mafia's secrets safe, Omertà. Omertà is more than just a rule, it's a way of life for the Mafia. This strict code of silence ensured that no member ever cooperated with law enforcement. No snitching, no confessions. If you got arrested, you took the fall. If you talked, you disappeared. The consequences for breaking Omertà were severe. A snitch wasn't just exiled from the Mafia, they were often executed in brutal fashion to serve as a warning to others. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was life or death, and the Mafia had systems in place to make sure this loyalty was enforced. The hierarchy was built on fear and control, with bosses at the top ensuring that everyone beneath them understood the stakes. This code allowed the Mafia to thrive for decades, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to gather intel. But while Omertà was their greatest strength, it would also become their Achilles heel, because when it finally broke, the entire organization began to crumble. Now, if you think the Mafia just stuck to shady backroom deals and underground crime, think again. They weren't just breaking laws, they were influencing the people who made them. One of the Mafia's greatest weapons wasn't guns or threats, it was money. With the right bribes and the right favors, they could buy off politicians, judges, and law enforcement to look the other way. Need zoning laws changed? A few envelopes of cash could make that happen. Need a competitor's business to suddenly fail? The right connections could make life very difficult for them. But let's talk about one of the biggest alleged Mafia connections in American history, the Kennedy connection. Rumors persist that the Mafia played a role in John F. Kennedy's election, helping him win key states through voter intimidation and ballot manipulation. But when JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, became Attorney General and declared war on organized crime, things took a dark turn. Many believe the Mafia felt betrayed, and some even speculate that they had a hand in JFK's assassination. It's one of history's biggest conspiracy theories, and while there's no solid proof, the Mafia's reach into politics was undeniable. Of course, politicians weren't the only ones getting fed up with the Mafia's power. The US government eventually launched major investigations to expose Mafia corruption. The Kefauver hearings and the McClellan Committee brought the Mafia's secret dealings into public view, laying the groundwork for future crackdowns. But while the US was turning up the heat, the Mafia was already expanding its influence worldwide. Organized crime wasn't just an Italian or American problem. The Mafia's influence stretched across the entire world, partnering with criminal organizations in South America, Eastern Europe, and Asia. In Italy, you had factions like the 'Ndrangheta and Camorra, who controlled everything from drug trafficking to political bribes. In Russia, the Russian Mafia emerged as a powerful force, specializing in arms smuggling, cybercrime, and extortion. And let's talk about one of the biggest business ventures the Mafia ever got into, the drug trade. Smuggling alcohol during Prohibition made them rich, but drugs? That made them filthy rich. The Mafia built massive partnerships with South American cartels, transporting cocaine and heroin across the globe. Of course, you can't run a global crime empire without a way to hide your money. This is where money laundering networks came into play. The Mafia funneled billions through offshore accounts, real estate investments, and fake companies, ensuring that their illegal profits looked completely legitimate on paper. At this point, the Mafia had become a global powerhouse, but no empire lasts forever. And as governments wised up, they began fighting back harder than ever. At the height of its power, the Mafia wasn't just some underground gang running small-time scams, it was a multi-billion-dollar empire, with operations spanning multiple industries, both legal and illegal. Let's start with illegal activities, the Mafia's bread and butter. They made their fortune through drug trafficking, extortion, illegal gambling, money laundering, and even cybercrime in the modern age. They didn't just break the law, they ran entire underground economies that operated outside of government oversight. But here's the genius of their business model: they laundered dirty money through legitimate front businesses. Restaurants, construction companies, and even financial institutions acted as covers to clean their illegal earnings. A pizzeria or a car wash might look like an everyday business on the outside, but behind closed doors, it was moving millions of dollars in criminal profits. And, of course, you can't run an international crime syndicate without global financial networks. The Mafia used offshore banking, cryptocurrency, and high-end real estate to hide their illicit wealth. Some of the world's most luxurious properties? Funded by organized crime. Some of the most secretive Swiss bank accounts? You guessed it, Mafia money. For decades, they played this game to perfection, operating in the shadows while authorities struggled to track their assets. But eventually, the government found a way to fight back, and when they did, it shook the entire Mafia world to its core. For years, law enforcement struggled to take down the Mafia. They knew who the big players were, but actually proving anything was another story. Mafia bosses didn't write things down, they rarely spoke on the phone, and thanks to Omertà, nobody was willing to testify against them. Then came the game changer, the RICO Act of 1970. This law allowed prosecutors to charge entire crime families as organized entities, rather than just going after individuals. Now, instead of taking down one boss at a time, the government could dismantle entire syndicates in one move. And it worked. Some of the most infamous Mafia bosses in history were brought down, including John Gotti, the Teflon Don, finally convicted in 1992 after years of evading charges. Al Capone, taken down not for his crimes, but for tax evasion. Lucky Luciano, exiled from the US despite being one of the Mafia's founding figures. The FBI also ramped up its efforts, using surveillance, wiretaps, undercover agents, and informants to infiltrate Mafia families from the inside. Perhaps the biggest betrayal? Mafia members themselves started breaking Omertà, turning informants in exchange for protection and reduced sentences. The result? The once mighty Mafia found itself under siege. But even though the classic era of the Mafia was collapsing, organized crime wasn't disappearing, it was evolving. You might be thinking, alright, so the Mafia was taken down. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly. While the old-school, flashy Mafia bosses of the 20th century are mostly gone, organized crime didn't disappear, it adapted. Instead of running speakeasies and shaking down shop owners, the modern Mafia has gone digital. One of their biggest new ventures? Cybercrime and fraud. Forget breaking kneecaps. Why do that when you can steal millions through online scams, hacking, and cryptocurrency fraud? The Mafia has kept up with the times, moving into the world of financial crimes, investment scams, and high-tech laundering operations. Speaking of money, real estate and financial markets have become a major tool for modern crime families. Buying up luxury properties, manipulating financial markets, and investing in high-end developments allow them to move money across borders without raising suspicion. Some of the world's biggest real estate purchases? Funded by dirty money. And let's not forget political and business infiltration. While the Mafia may not be running entire governments, they still know how to pull strings behind the scenes. From influencing business deals and public contracts to funding politicians, the Mafia ensures that their power remains hidden but very real. So, while the days of Tommy guns and backroom gambling may be over, the Mafia is far from extinct. It's simply evolved, just like it always has. Now, let's talk about how Hollywood shaped our perception of the Mafia. If you've ever watched The Godfather, Goodfellas, or The Sopranos, you've probably noticed something: Mafia figures aren't just villains, they're anti-heroes. Films and TV shows have romanticized crime lords, portraying them as powerful, intelligent, and, in some cases, even honorable in their own way. The idea of the Mafia code, loyalty, and respect is often played up in fiction, making these criminals seem almost admirable, when in reality, the real Mafia was built on fear, violence, and corruption. But pop culture didn't just shape how we see the Mafia, it actually influenced real-life criminals. Some Mafia members reportedly took inspiration from movies, adopting mannerisms, catchphrases, and even business tactics from their on-screen counterparts. Imagine watching The Godfather and thinking, hey, that's a great idea for my crime empire. However, there's a downside to this media portrayal. It often glamorizes organized crime, ignoring the brutal realities of the Mafia's violence, exploitation, and destruction. At the end of the day, the Mafia isn't a Hollywood script, it's a real force that has shaped history in ways far darker than any movie can capture. So, what can we learn from the Mafia's story? First, the Mafia's rise. What began as small Sicilian protection groups eventually evolved into a global criminal empire. showing how power can grow from even the most unexpected places. Second, political and economic power. The mafia thrived by infiltrating key industries, corrupting officials, and controlling entire markets, proving that money and influence are often more powerful than violence alone. And finally, secrecy and adaptability. Omertà and the ability to evolve with technology have kept the mafia relevant for over a century. Every time authorities cracked down, the mafia found a new way to survive. But this leads us to one final question. Despite decades of crackdowns, organized crime hasn't disappeared. In fact, it continues to shape global economies, politics, and industries in ways most people never see. The mafia has moved into new criminal frontiers, from cybercrime to financial fraud, proving that the methods may change, but the game remains the same. And that brings us to the big question: can organized crime ever be fully eradicated? Or will it always find a way to adapt and survive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out my other videos on truth behind history. There's plenty more where this came from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.